The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
The Florida Historical Society Press publishes books on a variety of topics relating to our state's diverse history and culture. FHS Press titles include Life and Death at Windover, Excavations of a 7,000-Year-Old Pond Cemetery, The Voyages of Ponce de Leon, Scholarly Perspectives, Hollow Victory, a novel of the Second Seminole War, Stetson Kennedy's Palmetto Country, and Walk in Lawton. More information at fhspress.org. Florida Frontiers is also sponsored in part by the State of Florida through the Division of Arts and Culture and the National Endowment for the Arts. When the 20th century began, the American Civil War was only 35 years in the past. After the war, southern states, including Florida, enacted black codes, which were laws intended to limit the rights and freedoms of formerly enslaved people and their descendants. During this period, the state of Florida had the highest number of lynchings per capita of any southern state. White people could abuse or even kill African Americans with little fear of being held accountable. This led to the intimidation of the surviving family members of victims of racial violence.
Nobody talked about this. This was a family secret that just wasn't discussed.
Welcome to Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. I'm Ben Brotmarkle. The Reverend A.S.J. Allen was a respected African-American community leader in Alachua County, Florida. In 1904, he was killed by a white neighbor over a property border dispute. In the Jim Crow era, the white neighbor faced no consequences for his actions. Growing up, Alonzo Felder heard just a few stories about his great-grandfather, A.S.J. Allen.
He owned property adjacent to the Shaw property. And the story I heard was that from the family that I did get to talk, is that he was working the fields. It was around, according to the newspaper, around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And he notices that there's some fence construction happening out in the field. So he and his daughter, Ella, walk out to see what's going on. And he sees that the boundary stone has been moved. So back in the olden days, they literally had a big boulder, a boundary stone, and that marked the property line between your neighbor and yourself. There's an indentation in the ground where the boundary stone has been moved, and the neighbor's new fence is encroaching on his side of where the boundary stone used to be. He confronts the neighbor about it, and the guy goes in the house, comes back with a gun, and shoots him. End of discussion.
Some contemporary newspaper accounts had more details than others, but all agreed that the Reverend A.S.J. Allen was shot and killed by his white neighbor, Joseph Shaw, on April 21, 1904.
Prior to his killing and even after his killing, you read newspaper reports when a white person kills a black person, it's hardly newsworthy. And when it does make the news, it's just this little tiny thing, and it's a hush situation and nobody thinks about it. When it is especially when it's a racially motivated type killing, typically the white newspaper is not going to cover it. And the community effect is, this guy is dead, and that's sending a message to the rest of you all. So it's sort of like we talk about lynching here in America. When someone is lynched, it was very uncommon for the family of the lynched victim to ever get the body. There was no funeral. There was no talk about it in public, because the whole point of the lynching is to send a message. That body stays up there in that tree. You don't touch it, because we want all y'all to see that this is what happens when you get out of line. So I paint that picture as in terms of context. The 1904 Southwestern Advocate newspaper gives us a picture of the building we're in, the Mount Nebo Methodist Church, the original building, being constructed and having their first service on, that morning service. That afternoon, A.S.J. enters the building. And that's the second service held in the building was a funeral, and it was his funeral. The newspaper reports that approximately 800 people came out. This is a small community. To find 800 people, I'm thinking, whoa, that's phenomenal right there. But 800 people came out for his funeral. After the funeral, you'll start looking at the newspaper reporting, because it made the paper, that the community, and it lists very specifically that the church, the local Masons, the Masonic Lodge, the Odd Fellows, and other community farmers came together. They hired 2 attorneys, one from Gainesville and one from Jacksonville, and they took this whole matter to court, saying this was not a justifiable homicide, this was a murder. And they hired attorneys to try and prove that. Then that's unheard of in 1904 Florida, that a small community of black folks get together to take a white guy to court over a justifiable homicide.
Despite the unprecedented public outcry for justice in the killing of A.S.J. Allen, none was to be had.
There was a grand jury investigation. So a coroner's report was filled out because of the way he died. There was a grand jury investigation, and the grand jury returned a no bill. So when you have an incident, the way our legal system works is it first goes to a grand jury to see if indeed a crime was committed. If they determine that yes, a crime was committed and it's worthy of going to court, then a bill is created, and that's how you get on the docket to appear before a judge. The grand jury said, no bill. This is not crime worthy.
Well, Alonzo, in 1904, your great-grandfather was killed right along this property line. Mm-hmm. When was the first time that you came to this property?
Would have been around 1960, maybe 61. I would travel with my grandmother, who was A.S.J's youngest child. She would come for funerals in the family, and no matter where we go, we always end up in the Mount Nebo Cemetery. So that would have been early 60s would have been my first visit to this property.
Now, doing all of this research on A.S.J. Allen, you really connected with him. And so how do you feel walking along this property where he was killed?
There's a sense of reverence, I think, that anyone would feel walking through a cemetery where you know that this is where your ancestors are buried. But there's also this awkward feeling of knowing that this is where he was killed. That this ground that gave him his livelihood also received his blood. It gives it a sense of not just a memorial, but there's a sadness about being here. I love it when I can touch things that my ancestors owned and be able to put myself in the positions where maybe they were. So maybe he stood here and this is the view that he looked at. So it's very much a connecting kind of feeling to know that this is where he worked, this is where he lived, but then this is also where he died. So it's little mixed feelings in there.
Now there's a two-lane highway that runs right in front of this property. What's the
Yeah.
name of that highway?
That is the Shaw Highway, named after the man, the family responsible for my grandfather's death. And that is, it's a bit of an awkward feeling to know that he's memorialized and I drive on Shaw Highway, turn into the church property here, and we're still looking for the grave site, the burial site for my grandfather. He's yet to be memorialized here. We know that he was born in 1865 in Alabama. We know that his parents were born in South Carolina. So I can get that from census records. But that's about all I know. The next piece of information that I learned about A.S.J. came from church records. So with his obituary, the Methodist Church made an announcement about his death and for a little bit about him. And it tells us that he moved to the state of Florida from Alabama 28 years ago. So that would have put him at age 11 when he moved to Florida. He comes into Florida, don't know a whole lot about his early years, but he fell in love with one of the Limbrick girls. The Limbrick family was very large, prominent African-American family here in the Alachua, Gainesville area, and had a number of girls. He married Dinah and thus started a family. He was very close to Dinah's brother, who was a Methodist preacher. And as I did my research, I started seeing all of these incidences of placement for A.S.J. And everywhere I see A.S.J., I see Z.D. Limbrick. So the stories I heard from my uncle, Wilbert, his second youngest child, is that they preached together. And the records are showing that in terms of their proximity.
Several years before A.S.J. Allen was killed, his wife Dinah passed away, leaving him as a single father with 9 children. As Alonzo Felder continued his genealogical research, he discovered more about A.S.J. Allen's work as both a farmer and a traveling preacher.
He was what's known as a CC rider, a county circuit rider. And what these people would do is they were on horseback, they were in a buckboard, they would take their families and they would go from community to community. So you have a poor community in Citra, Florida. They can't afford their own preacher. So the first Sunday of the month, he's going to be there. You've got another poor congregation in Waldo. They can't afford a preacher. So the second Sunday of the month, he's there. And that's how I traced my grandfather, is I see him moving all over the area of Central Florida.
The book Discovering A.S.J. Allen, A Story of Skinfolk, Kinfolk, and Village Folk, is really 3 books in one. It's the story of A.S.J. Allen's productive life and tragic death, Alonzo Felder's personal journey of self-discovery, and a practical guidebook for others wanting to find out more about their family history.
A lot of times when folks are interested in genealogy, they really, for whatever reason, they start with pedigree charts. So my mom was married to my dad, and then you go back and her mom and her dad were married, and they had her and his mom, and it's a very European way of doing a family tree. There's another way. I personally don't like pedigree charts because pedigree charts, they focus on surnames, and as one genealogist once told me, surnames don't make babies. So I like to do genograms. A genogram will tell me that there's mom and dad, and there may be a dotted line to mom's boyfriend. And there may be a whole bunch of other children out here that are indeed brothers and sisters, but they don't fit in that traditional mom-dad pedigree chart. When I do a genogram, I can include the people who are kinfolk and who are village folk, because there are so many families in America where we have these things called other mothers. Okay, I had two of them that were not related to me at all, but you better believe if I was in trouble, they were there. But there's no DNA between us, but I think they deserve to be on that family tree, because these are the people who raised us. You have situations where daughter becomes pregnant and she's unmarried, she moves back home. Grandma is raising her daughter and her daughter's children. Well, grandma gets married, that guy needs to be on that, tree, even though there's no blood there. So I think doing a genogram that includes both the village folk and the kinfolk gives you a better picture of a family unit, because that's telling you who has influence in this family.
While Alonzo Felder was always curious about his great-grandfather, A.S.J. Allen, there was another catalyst that really got him started in his genealogical research.
Tipping point for me was when my mom died. I was overcome with this feeling that I'm an orphan. I don't have people anymore. I had lost all the elders in the family, so the connection to the old people, the old history. When mom died, it was gone, and I felt very much alone. And a part of my healing process was to find my people. So quite literally, I remember sitting with a friend of mine, whose name was Ben, in a cafeteria, and I said, I'm at a loss. I don't have people. He says, well, what are you going to do about it? I said, well, I really want to go walk among the tombstones. I know it sounds weird, but I just want to get a connection to my people. And he said, well, road trip. And we packed up and we came to Mount Nebo, and literally walked among the tombstones. And once I did that, I started getting names that were familiar, surnames, names of people I'd heard little stories about but didn't know anything about. So once I got back home, I was a family history detective at that point.
We're in the woods that are adjacent to the more modern cemetery that's right next door to Mount Nebo Church. But this area is really where your most ancient ancestors are buried, right?
Absolutely. This is what we're seeing now is the back of the building, the property. But let me give you a little orientation. In the earlier days, that highway was just a dirt road. It was a path. The major entry and access to this area was along a road that used to run back in this area. So the older relatives are all buried back in this part of the cemetery, which would have been the front. In the 1960s, the Klan burned a number of churches here in the area, including Mount Nebo. And what the congregation decided to do was, when they rebuilt at the same location, but they turned the building around. So this was the front of the property, which is why we see all of these Limbrick, Allen, Dobie tombs, grave sites up in this part. You would have passed them coming into Mount Nebo.
Now, A.S.J. Allen's grave is not marked, but it must be somewhere around here, right?
It's got to be, because we have his mentor, his wife's brother right over here, Z.D. Limbrick. We've got a bunch of other family members, Limbrick family members, two of his daughters are right over here. So it just makes sense that he and Dinah would be somewhere in this part of the property.
Now, are you keeping that search ongoing for his gravesite?
Absolutely. Every chance I get, I really wish that I lived in this area, because I'm retired. You would find me here every single day with my little rake and prodding around to clean up this area and to see what I could discover. Everybody in the family, we all have this internal thing we do where no matter where in the world we live, no matter how we die and what kind of burial we have, you end up at the Mount Nebo Methodist Church Cemetery. I've got so many of my relatives that are buried in this cemetery, others who we walk on their ashes every day and we don't know, because folks come back and I get these phone calls of so-and-so's died and we cremated them and we're taking the ashes to Mount Nebo. Everybody comes back to Mount Nebo, and that is just, it's who we are, it's what we do, and I think telling the story helps people to understand this place and its place in our history.
Felder learned a lot about A.S.J. Allen's history through the Southwestern Christian Advocate newspaper, which chronicled his activities as he preached around Central Florida. Felder says that the newspaper can be a valuable tool for genealogical research, particularly for African Americans.
Especially in the early days after emancipation, this is a newspaper that ran those Find My Family ads, where enslaved people would be able to put an ad in the newspaper, and on Sunday morning, the preacher would get up and he would read these ads saying, hey, I used to be owned by so-and-so, and they moved me from Georgia to Florida or whatever, and they'd get the names, and the plea was, is anybody out there that can help me find my lost family? So A.S.J. was a real advocate for this newspaper, and they covered him like crazy. I mean, he is in just about every edition. So I learned a lot about him here in Alachua, out in Cedar Key. He was at Rosewood. He was all over Central Florida.
The response to Felder's book has been positive. In 2023, Felder was presented with the Harry T. and Harriet V. Moore Book Award from the Florida Historical Society in recognition of his work.
I have found that folks are enjoying the read because I give so many personal examples and show documentation and legal documents in there. I can't teach from a place of just pure academia. I have to be able to say, I'm telling you my lived experience. And I think that helps people to know that I'm just not out writing a book to bang a buck, but I really believe in what I'm doing. And folks have asked me for more. I recently just was reached out to by the Duke Online Learning Institute, asking me if I would do a class on family history discovery. And it's all because one of the people there saw the book, knew me, read the book, and said, oh yeah, you've got to teach this. And I'm in the middle of classes right now, and I limit it to small groups of about 14 people so we can have conversation as we go, and folks are really enjoying it. My goal is to inspire you and to give you tools, and so far that seems to be working.
The story of A.S.J. Allen was almost a forgotten footnote in Florida history, but thanks to Alonzo Felder, it's now an inspiration for others to research their ancestry. You've been watching Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. Find us anytime online at myfloridahistory.org. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ben Brotmarkle. The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jesse Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
The Florida Historical Society Press publishes books on a variety of topics relating to our state's diverse history and culture. FHS Press titles include Life and Death at Windover, Excavations of a 7,000-Year-Old Pond Cemetery, The Voyages of Ponce de Leon, Scholarly Perspectives, Hollow Victory, a novel of the Second Seminole War, Stetson Kennedy's Palmetto Country, and Walk in Lawton. More information at fhspress.org. Florida Frontiers is also sponsored in part by the State of Florida through the Division of Arts and Culture and the National Endowment for the Arts.